Hey everybody, welcome back. So today our lecture is going to be focusing on counterterrorism. We're going to start pivoting to try to understand how we can end terrorism in this last week of the course. What are some various ways to try to combat it? We're going to look at social elements like how we attempt to try to de-radicalize individuals who have become extremists. And so today we're going to really be focusing on broad sketch ideas of how countries try to think about, come up with counterterrorism policies, and then what some of the options for counterterrorism policies are for countries. So, to develop a counterterrorism policy, we need to think about the objectives that a country wants to achieve. That's important for us to start out. So, a lot of these are probably going to seem relatively self-explanatory, but these are important things to consider, especially when you consider the type of threat that a country is facing. So first, they may want to think about, they want to reduce the number of incidents. That's an important thing to consider. How many incidents are occurring in a country, how they think about that may shape how they go about approaching what they're going to do to combat terrorism. We have to think about reducing the number of deaths and injuries, right? You got to think about the type of terrorism that's occurring. Perhaps it's primarily not just focused on property damage, it's focused on targeting individuals, whether killing them or injuring them. So this is an important thing for countries to factor in and consider. Reduction in cost of damages. So this again gets to this idea of, are terrorist incidents causing significant property damage, infrastructure damage? Thinking about the types of damages that are occurring and how to stop those are important things for countries to think about. They have to think about perhaps the reduction in the size of a terrorist group. And so we can think about this in a number of ways, whether it's arresting these individuals, whether it's killing these individuals, whether it's trying to de-radicalize these individuals. There's a lot of different ways that countries can try to achieve this objective of trying to reduce the size of terrorist groups, and may be very context dependent. Also, again, look at, the number of terrorists killed and captured could be a focus, and that sort of fits in some ways with this idea of the reduction in the size of the terrorist group. And also another thing to think about here, and it's important to remember, is this preservation of national policies. And what I mean by this, I guess, here we want to think specifically about our debates and conversation we had when we thought about democracies and counterterrorism. We talked about the U.S., for example, with the Patriot Act. So we have to think about, what are countries willing to give up in order to, in terms of civil liberties, civil rights, to try and perhaps increase national security. Because oftentimes it's seen that there is a trade-off between the two, right? So countries have to be cognizant of these particular trade-offs, preserving particular rights for individuals, while also trying to ensure there's an increase in security. And how you do this is very difficult, but this is an important thing to consider, an important objective of counterterrorism policies. So how do they go about constructing these counterterrorism policies? And this is a very simplified version of thinking about it, but I think it gives you a rough idea of how countries go about creating policies. And so the U.S., for example, most presidents, when they come into office at some point, usually generate a national counterterrorism strategy. And it's, in some instances, if an administration is elected for a second term, is reelected, they may even publish another national counterterrorism strategy, depending on how particular contexts have changed since their initial publication. So this is something that in the United States, most administrations are focused on, and then around the world, most governments are often concerned at creating counterterrorism policies and then also updating them over time. So an important thing to think about at the outset is, how does a country perceive the terrorist issue, right? So we can think about this in a number of ways. Are they dealing primarily with domestic terrorism? Are they dealing primarily with homegrown violent extremism? Or are they primarily dealing with terrorist threats happening at an international level that may not necessarily be occurring within their own borders significantly? So this makes a big difference for how they're going to pursue action, right? We just think about this to your discussions that we had when we talked about domestic terrorism, homegrown violent extremism in the U.S., as well as trying to deal with domestic terrorist groups versus foreign terrorist organizations, and how there are differences in what the government can do. And so this is an important thing to consider, and how a country then goes about trying to build their strategy largely depends on the context of their particular terrorism issue. And then we also have to think about what factors determine a country's willingness to work with other countries, right? So this again is, in this, I'm taking the assumption here of building an international counterterrorism strategy moving beyond just the domestic context. But if you're going to work in the international realm, it's going to be important to consider how countries are willing to work together, how they're willing to cooperate or not to try to combat terrorist organizations. And we can see the U.S. tries to work with a number of countries to combat terrorism, both democratic and authoritarian countries. It's not exclusive to just democratic allies. And unfortunately, in certain instances, this has led the U.S. to take fairly extreme measures, especially in the early 2000s, when the U.S. was willing to engage in extraordinary rendition, where they would kidnap individuals in other countries who were suspected of terrorist acts, and they would take them to allies, places like Egypt, I believe Morocco, where they would use essentially torture. They would call it enhanced interrogation, but would use torture to try to get information from suspected terrorists. And so this is where they would also use not only their, this is an example of using their more authoritarian allies to try and gain information that they thought could be useful. And they also are very willing to work with their democratic allies as well. I mean, one example of this would be what we call the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, comprised of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And these countries share an extensive amount of what you call signals intelligence. So this is like electronic communications intelligence with each other to try to combat and stop terrorism. So this is very, very an example of a high level of integration amongst intelligence communities from various countries working together to try to prevent terrorism. So we need to think about how much countries are willing to work with each other to think about how they're willing to stop terrorism. And then we also want to think about how successful or unsuccessful previous policies have been, right? It's important to consider whether what countries have done in the past was effective, and that whether even those successes in the past would pertain to the present. This is getting back to the idea of, has the terrorist issue changed within a country? And this is important to think about. So where for a long time Britain's primary terrorist concern was the IRA in Northern Ireland, throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, up until 1998, when they signed the Belfast Agreement that essentially disbanded the IRA for the most part and created peace in Northern Ireland. This is a much different issue for the United Kingdom than trying to combat far-right extremists now, as well as more Islamic extremists, homegrown violent extremists. So you have these two groups that are much more of a concern for the British government now than Northern Irish separatists. And how they think about and how they combat those groups is very different than, and what's successful for one may not be successful for the other. So that's important to think about. So there are various components to developing a strategy: military components, diplomatic, and social. And we're mainly just going to focus on the military components and diplomatic components in this particular lecture. In our discussion of de-radicalization, we get much more into these elements of social aspects of countering terrorism and trying to, prevent radicalization from ever happening to begin with, but also how it can facilitate, how communities, families, society as a whole can facilitate de-radicalization. So we're going to hold that off for another lecture. So let's jump right into thinking about different counterterrorism strategies and thinking about how perhaps different goals, different objectives may make military response is more effective in some instances, and then we're also going to look at when diplomacy might work particularly well. So what we can say is that how we, think about military responses, we need to evaluate its effectiveness. So what are the objectives, right? Military responses to terrorism are particularly effective in a couple of ways, in a couple of particular objectives. One, if we want to think about retaking territory is an important component. Perhaps de-incentivizing state sponsorship of terror. We're going to focus on this in our case study when we look at the U.S. responses to Libya's state sponsorship of terrorism, especially in the 1980s. And then also military response and it being perhaps effective when targeting individuals and trying to eliminate particular people. So we're going to look here more in depth at retaking territory and targeting individuals. So you may remember this from our case study where we looked at ISIS. Well, we can see here a military strategy can be particularly effective if a terrorist organization sees controlling large territory as one of its primary objectives. So ISIS wanted to create an Islamic caliphate, right? It wants to create a state. So unlike more traditional terrorist organizations, it's really seeking to carve out a new piece of territory that it is in control of. And so we can see here at its height in 2015, it's controlling large chunks of Syria and Iraq. But to ultimately push back and really reduce the size of territory that ISIS controlled, it really required a significant military push by a lot of groups. The U.S. assisted a lot of groups. A lot of the heaviest fighting in some ways was done by the Kurds who live in Syria and Iraq. They played a major role in trying to push back and defeat ISIS. Certain elements of the Syrian rebel groups played a role. So this is an important feature because it can be particularly difficult to negotiate the forfeiture of land. ISIS had no intention to try to negotiate a solution to then ultimately give up its territorial claims. The territorial claims were a key component of its particular objective, to build a global Islamic state. So in this case, military force was particularly necessary to try and ultimately reduce the total amount of territory that they control. We also said they can be particularly effective in trying to take out particular individuals of concern. And so we can see here, we have the capacity, especially currently with the use of drone strikes, with the use of, with the capacity to engage in a lot more surveillance, intelligence gathering around the world to pinpoint the location of individuals. These people can be found and can ultimately be killed by governments around the world to take out particular individuals. So most famously would be the U.S. raid on Osama bin Laden. But even this proves a very, very difficult task. If anybody's ever watched the movie, I recommend Zero Dark 30. It describes the over a decade long, roughly, about 15-year, no less than 15 years, but over a decade long process of trying to find Osama bin Laden, ultimately find him, and then use a military strike to take him out in his home in Pakistan. And then we also have another example here of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He was previously the head of ISIS, and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was again taken out in a military strike and was a particularly effective move based on the capacity of the military to operate fairly quickly and effectively around the world to take out one individual that they know the location of. But it's important to remember this is a fairly limited goal as well. It's just trying to take out one particular individual. As I said, it can be especially difficult. Osama bin Laden was able to evade capture or detection for a long period of time, but it can be effective once those individuals are identified. But we don't just have military as an option for combating terrorism, right? We have the options of using diplomacy. And diplomacy can be a effective strategy, but may depend on the context. And some of the contexts that are most effective, perhaps, for engaging in diplomacy are: one, ending hostage situations, and two, ending protracted conflicts, drawn out conflicts between particular groups. This can be important. So here you see a picture of President Clinton with Yitzhak Rabin, I believe, and Yasser Arafat in the 1990s trying to work out a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which many had labeled as a terrorist group, but trying to basically find a solution for the Palestinian-Israel problem. So we'll look at both of these. So we look at hostage trading. So hostage trading can be effective in particular instances of trying to solve a short-term issue of ending a situation where terrorists may be in control and have captured particular individuals that governments want to get back. And many governments have engaged in hostage trading to try to resolve particular situations with terrorist organizations. So the US, Israel, and the United Kingdom are just a couple examples of countries that have done so. The United States was willing to trade multiple former leaders of the Taliban who were being held in U.S. custody for this individual named, I believe he was a staff sergeant named Bo Bergdahl, who had been kidnapped by the Taliban. His story is very complicated. If you want a breakdown of what happened to Bo Bergdahl, I would recommend listening to the second season of the podcast Serial. There's a very long, in-depth breakdown into how Bo Bergdahl ended up being captured by the Taliban, largely based on doing some things he should not have been doing and being held for many years before the U.S. negotiated his release. Israel's been willing to engage in hostage negotiations at various times. There's perhaps a reputation that Israel always responds with extreme force to what they perceive as Palestinian terrorists, but they also have at times been willing to engage in hostage trading to try and prevent further conflict and be willing to give up Palestinians who they have held captive for Israelis that Palestinians are holding captive. So hostage trading is a potential solution to some short-term, very specific incidents that countries can use to try to, end a terrorist incident through hostage trading. So we want to think about also we want to think about effective diplomacy in general as well. And we want to think about, well, who can diplomacy work on? And this is important to think about. So one of the main things you want to think about if a country's trying to engage in diplomacy with a terrorist group, a terrorist organization, is what is the ideology of that group, right? Do they have an absolutist framework of thinking? So this gets back to our discussion, right, of perhaps the capacity for governments to more effectively argue or negotiate, engage in diplomacy with political movements, whether the right or the left, versus religious extremist movements, right? we've talked about the intensity of religious terrorism, perhaps in comparison to political terrorism, or more politically, ideologically based terrorism. And more absolutist framings may make organizations less willing to compromise. It may also just depend on particular context. We also have to consider a group's approach to violence. Did this group originate as a violent organization, or did they become violent in response to a perceived sense of being pushed out of politics? So this can play an important role. Groups that start out perhaps in a democratic framework and move towards violence may be more willing to then revert back to a democratic framework of engaging in the political sphere than a violent one. So that's important to think about. And then we also want to consider the internal cohesion of an organization. So organizations that have very hierarchical structures that allow leaders at the top to play a big role in controlling those underlings in their organization may have a better time at engaging in negotiations, and especially if the whole group is on board with trying to take another route, this can open up the door for engaging in diplomacy. And then we also have to think about whether groups are being sponsored by sponsored by other countries. You had your whole, maybe you had to write about state sponsorship of terrorism. Well, if the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is being sponsored by Syria, well, maybe negotiations with the group are going to be difficult as they continue to have Syrian backing and Syrian influence that may play a role in shaping the decisions that they make. So sponsors, if organizations are sponsored by other states, this can complicate the role of trying to engage in diplomacy. So when can diplomacy be effective? This is an important thing to consider. And we're going to have a discussion of the FARC, I believe, in the end of your last case study on the last day of class next Tuesday. So that'll be, we'll get more in depth on the FARC then, but it's important to think about the state of an organization and its willingness to consider engaging in diplomacy. So in the 1990s, the FARC was particularly strong, and so was this. The FARC is a terrorist organization that had operated in Colombia and South America. And when organizations are successfully gaining recruits, taking land, getting resources, they're going to be perhaps less willing to compromise and negotiate with governments, right? Because they see themselves as being successful. And when organizations see themselves being successful, the incentive for them to change course is limited. So really depending on the context of when an organization negotiates matters. And there's also concerns as well that if a group is perceived as too weak, a government may not want to negotiate with them either. They may think they have the capacity to eliminate them without giving them any concessions because they perceive them as weak. So in some ways, the sweet spot may be between an organization, a terrorist organization, being very strong and very weak, somewhere in the middle, where there perhaps is, and especially in a prolonged situation, groups may be willing to consider a new option in these circumstances. And then we want to think about, how we actually achieve effective diplomacy. And one of the main arguments for creating effective agreements between governments and terrorist organizations is divide the issues that they're discussing into two categories. And it's what they call primary issues, and the other is called secondary fate, what happens to the group. So primary issues are really trying to work to resolve what is the conflict over? What are the issues at hand? What does the group want? What does the government want? Trying to work to try to come to negotiation over those particular issues. So this way of dividing up issues into categories was something that worked particularly effective in the Belfast Agreement here, which is a picture of the negotiations of the Belfast Agreement in 1998, which essentially brought an end to a lot of the attacks carried out by the IRA. And then the secondary issues is really what happens to the group. Are there going to be individuals in the group who get punished, who go to jail? Is there certain types of immunity, amnesty that gets applied? Can that group become now a participant, if it's a democratic country, can they become a participant in the democratic process? Can they become a political party? So these are issues as well. But it's important, they say, to divide these two issues up to ensure that it smooths out the negotiation process and these things don't get conflated. Because if it becomes conflated about trying to negotiate the primary issues at hand, as well as also discussing what's ultimately going to happen to that group, this can make it more difficult to find a solution. And with that, I think we basically covered most of what I wanted to talk about when we talk about counterterrorism strategies and counterterrorism in general. So to end, I'll give you both your discussion questions. So discussion question 1 is, why is there no one-size-fits-all counterterrorism strategy? Again, discussion question 1, why is there no one-size-fits-all counterterrorism strategy? And now discussion question number 2, why do you think terrorism can be so difficult to defeat militarily? Again, discussion question 2, why do you think terrorism can be so difficult to defeat militarily? All right, that's all I have for y'all today. I hope you enjoy the case study next, and I will talk to you soon.